Hello, everybody. My name is Alfonso Montuori. I'm a professor in the Transformative Studies and Transformative Leadership programs at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And today we're going to talk briefly about transdisciplinarity and creativity and what they have to do with academia, why they're relevant, why they're important, and why they may change the way that we work in academia. So I'd like to start with creativity because creativity is not a term that a lot of people that I speak to typically associate with academia, right? I mean, people think of science and research and things like that, but don't really imagine that there's a lot of creativity involved in that process. And in fact, the way that social science and science in general present themselves doesn't really address creativity at all. It's made to seem as if it is a very methodical, logical, rational process. And if we hear about creativity, it's only when we read the biographies or autobiographies of scientists or social scientists who then tell us how they actually got the ideas. And in the philosophy of social science, people talk about two different things. They talk about the context of justification and the context of discovery. The context of justification is when you write an article or you present a thesis and you justify it. So you explain why other people should believe this. So we have that language of I defended my thesis, right? So the context of justification is like how you go out there and defend this point that you're trying to make, this research, this new insight, this new perspective, whatever. And then there's the context of discovery, which is how you got the idea to do this in the first place, but we don't talk about that. And Karl Popper, a famous philosopher, said that we don't talk about that. It's just too unpredictable. It's too subjective. It's psychological stuff. We don't really deal with that, which led to a very interesting situation, where in the end, what really matters in academia is the new ideas, new perspectives. I see books behind you there, Leila, Karl Marx, whatever people may think of him and whatever people may think of anybody who participates in academia is very much about new ideas, new perspectives, how to interpret situations, how to make sense of them. But we don't talk about how people get there, right? And so we typically don't address it in academia, right? There's a very famous YouTube talk by the late Ken Robinson. It's called "Do Schools Kill Creativity?" And spoiler, yes, they do. And he goes into this in some detail and also explains why. And it's clear that schools were never meant to stimulate creativity. They were never meant for creativity. They were meant to create obedient citizens who would have basic skills to do their jobs, right? And there'd be different levels of skills, right? If you went through very basic schooling, you could do certain kinds of jobs. And then if you got a little more education, God forbid, you could become a lawyer or whatever, right? But creativity, never part of the picture. And now, of course, the world has changed a little bit. And even in industry, innovation, creativity are considered very important. And people look around and go, well, wait a minute, there is no real emphasis on creativity and what they call thinking out of the box, right? And I teach in a doctoral program, and a number of you are in this doctoral program. And the definition of the PhD dissertation that is widely agreed upon, so I'm not just making this up for my own purposes, is that the PhD dissertation is an original contribution to a field. Now, considering the fact that original plays such a big part, it surprises me that in just about every university I'm aware of, there is not much more discussion about original than no plagiarism, right? When in fact there is now a huge literature on creativity. So there's lots of research about it, but not only that, but what would it be like to frame the entire PhD journey or any educational journey as a creative process, right? I think that would be very different because really, if the PhD dissertation is an original contribution to a field, then the whole PhD journey should be a creative process leading to a creative product, right? And the person engaging in it should be a person who, well, is minimally allowed to be creative, but can also approach the topic they are engaging in a creative way. So it seems odd to me that there's absolutely, well, very little attention to this, paid to this in most university contexts. Um, Lynn, you said, I believe law can be creative too. Absolutely, yes. I was just being a little playful there. But no, I definitely agree. Yes, law can definitely be creative. And the point here is not even so much that some topics lend themselves more to creativity than others. It's very much that the whole process of inquiry itself should be and can be creative, but sadly, it's not framed that way. And I think academia and social science perhaps have an image problem in the sense that they present themselves as I said, these sort of hyper rational, hyper intellectual, very sort of logical phenomena with a huge emphasis on the role of method. Right, you use the right method and you'll get somewhere. And and I think somehow method has kind of taken the place of creativity. And the bottom line is there is creativity in academia. You know, again, just looking at the books behind you there, Layla, lots of very creative work. But the point is that it's coming out, it's happening despite the way that we've shaped academia, right? And in fact there's lots more that we can do to foster creativity and to foster a different approach to inquiry. So one of the things that we've learned about creativity is that intrinsic motivation is very important. You know, you have to, if you do it because you're intrinsically motivated, meaning you're doing it because this fascinates you, then you are much more likely to be creative than if you're extrinsically motivated. In other words, doing it because of a reward down the road, right? And I think this is one of the first things that we need to get in touch with. And one of the things that happens, I think, if people, you know, very often people will go get a degree because they think it'll help with their career. But if you're not really into it, that can be painful down the road when you end up doing something that ultimately you're not really into. You know, so my suggestion is always to be aware of what really motivates you and what you really enjoy, because if ultimately you're much likely to be better at that. Um, there's um, one of the things that I think is most fascinating about the PhD is that because it takes a longer time, there is a whole dimension of it that is a process of self-creation. So it's not just, am I coming up with a great new idea with, a book, an article, a dissertation, but over the years that people work on their dissertation, every inquiry is a self inquiry if it's framed that way, because you ask yourself, well, why am I doing this? Why am I studying this particular topic? What drew me to this? What do I personally find exciting? What do I have to contribute? And because in the end, we're not just doing it for ourselves, we're also communicating with other people, and we're also wanting to make a difference in the world, presumably, right? We believe that we can we're not just observers, but we're participants and contributors, right? And so I think this is one of the areas of education in general, and I think it's can happen at all levels of education. But I think graduate education lends itself particularly well to that, because people have reached a certain level of maturity where they can do some introspection and so on. And the the element of creativity and the sense that we are actually creating something here. I'm creating something, but I'll also create myself, right? Who am I becoming here? I think is something that is a fascinating process, and I've really seen people transform uh, in the process. No, I agree that the arts are important, but I'm also concerned that we should not think that the arts are the only way that creativity can manifest itself, right? I think the arts are important. And at the same time, if you're getting a PhD in a certain field, my sense is you should develop that field. And sometimes I worry that people will bring in the arts, and if you're not really an artist, that can be problematic, right? Because then we're neither really scholars nor really artists, and it can be sort of a way to finesse things. That can be, but definitely, of course, I mean, there are lots of new approaches that involve the arts that are very interesting. But I think one of the things that I'd like you to really think about right now is, how has creativity manifested itself in academia, or I mean, in academia, in the world of ideas, right? I mean, what would be for you a creative contribution? What do you consider um, a contribution that you would say, yes, I think this is creative? Corey.
I feel like to answer that question, I'm going to use the example of actually taking my transformative leadership capstone action project, like to
Mm-hmm.
help people like access scholarships and funding, to actually have launching it this semester for my like in my first semester of the PhD. So for me, it's kind of like that took 2 years of writing and researching and understanding the concept of how to help others access funding through writing, which I think is creative, and then to build like a community space for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that's
That's
cool.
fantastic. Yeah, I agree. I agree. And
Okay.
so it doesn't have to be some major theory, some huge book that you put somewhere, right? There's lots of different ways
Yeah.
that you can be creative in an academic context. And I think it's a misunderstanding to assume that it has to be this big thing, and which this reflects also some of the changes in the way that people understand creativity now. Before, it was very much the genius, the creative genius, who then created, a great artist or a great scientist. Typically Einstein gets whipped out as an example, with some life-changing uh, uh, discovery or a work of art and so on. And now people are realizing that there are lots of different ways to be creative, and some of them are a lot more down to earth, practical, everyday, and that's where and actually referred to as everyday creativity. And that's actually where a lot of creativity is needed in everyday life. And Corey, in doing the kinds of things that you're doing, right? Serena, you said creativity in academia can manifest in how a spectrum of theories or models can be integrated in novel ways to address academic and practical real-world challenges. Absolutely, right? I mean, I see marks behind you there, Layla, and that definitely talk about a book that had a huge influenced more than half of the world, right?
Yeah.
Again, regardless of what you think
Yeah.
about it, ultimately it had a huge influence.
This is a brand new translation too. It just
Mm,
came out this week and it has a new slant. New translation means new interpretation.
mm,
But I'm interested in it. I've read so many different versions and then translations because I'm interested in theories of social change. And that's definitely
mm.
one of them. And it's fascinating to me. And I think that is creative. I think when someone comes up like Rian Eisler's partnership and dominator model, that's creative to me. She came up with a
Right.
new way to understand types of I don't know what you would call it, con types of consciousness that manifest in the world. I'm really intrigued by the writers and thinkers who create new frameworks and language. I love when new words and ideas are created, like your creative inquiry. I think that's, that in itself is a creative act that inspires me. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the really exciting things when you read something and as a result you see the world differently, right? As a result, you see the world differently, and that's definitely what happened to me. I met Rian Eisler. We're talking about Rian Eisler, who wrote a book called "The Chalice and the Blade" published in 1987, which is actually the year that I met her, and it went on to sell over 1 million copies, and it's yeah, very successful book, very interesting book, and at the time. I was certainly oblivious to issues of gender. And as you know, I actually interviewed her and her husband, the late David Loy, for a radio show I had down in Pacific Grove, and she said, "Well, why don't you look at creativity in women?" It never occurred to me at the time, and it really opened a lot of perspectives for me that I've been following pretty much ever since. Because and so for me, that was the kind of thing that you're talking about, Layla. Sort of thing is like really opened a whole new world because then I looked at women in politics, women in conceptions of human nature, and any number of women in authoritarianism. So it was really a quite. Quite rich. Lynn, you said speak to the pressures connected to creativity, the need to be creative at all times. Well, see, that makes it sound like it's an external issue, right? That there's a need because of external pressures to be creative, and the point here is not so much for it to be the result of external pressures, but for it to be sort of a natural part of our own way of being in the world, right? So that it's not like, well, I have to be creative here and or after. So it's not like creativity is something that I have to tack on and do sort of as a special extra, right? Creativity at a certain point then becomes just the way that we are in the world. And that doesn't mean that we're going to write a hugely successful book because a lot of that doesn't even have to do with creativity. It just means that we are allowed to express ourselves and not feel boxed in, if you will, by assumptions or concerns that ultimately have nothing to do with anything, but are more sort of societal restrictions, if you will, right? So that's what that's about. Yeah, so I wouldn't see it as a need to be creative. Like, I work for this organization and they want me to come up for a new idea for a product or something. That's really not what we're talking about. We're talking about sort of the spontaneous, uh, generative way of being in the world and interaction with the world. And you know, there's just so much that's interesting about creativity right now. Also, you know, sort of this view that creativity is being understood more systemically, more ecologically, if you will, right? Before, creativity was about the lone individual. Art would end up in a museum. Factories would be this, you know, source of you know, technology and creativity, but then they would just throw all the pollutants in the river, right? So there was no understanding of the importance of the larger context, the larger environment. You know, there was the mythology that the creative person didn't need anybody, that they didn't even need to study, that it was just his gift from God, and so on. And those myths are actually surprisingly pervasive. I mean, we may sort of laugh at them now, but if you look in popular parlance, there are a lot of these kinds of myths that persist, like don't let them see you sweat, right? That's one of the things that you know, artists are always told: don't let them see you sweat, right? Make it seem like for you this just happens miraculously because you're different from everybody else, right? And in the meantime, they're practicing 12 hours a day, right? But when you're out there, make it seem like it's effortless for you, right? Which dates way back to the Renaissance in Italy and the word sprezzatura, which makes it seem like, oh, I could just pull this, you know, right out of my hat. Um, and um, and also that, you know, they didn't need to study and so on. So there's a lot of really interesting material. You know, there's a question, right? Where does an idea come from? Where does a great song like Yesterday come from? Yesterday, Paul McCartney, some of you may remember it, probably the most performed song, pop song in the world, um, came to him in a dream, right? And now that's sexy. That's marketable, right? You can say it came to him in a dream, and then I would go, wow. You know, I never have songs come to me in a dream. Paul McCartney is really special. But then you hear the other part is that he didn't have any words for it. He just had the melody. And so in the beginning, he was just going scrambled eggs, da 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 da, da, because you know, it just, you know, being Paul McCartney, he would do something silly like that. Um, and then he remembered some other things. You know, people cobble these things together, and it's not that sexy and marketable if you really look at what's going on under the hood. But of course, you want to present it in such a way that makes you seem special, and that created that creative I'm not kind of a world, which, you know, has been around for a long time and is very I think disempowering and dysfunctional, because everybody is fundamentally creative. And one of the things that I've focused on, some of you may know, I mean, I've even written about how to turn the literature review, which most students tend to think of as a really boring kind of activity. That shouldn't be boring at all, really. I mean, in the end, it's you engaging with the people who care about what it is that, you know, you care about, right? And it's your opportunity to frame that whole discourse and say, well, these people are looking at it this way, that these people are looking at it that way, and it's your you know, people think they just have to say, well, so and so said this, so and so said that, so and so said that, which is really boring. But ultimately, you have much more of a creative opportunity to frame the whole discourse of your topic in such a way that you can sort of put your perspective out there that says, yes, there's this and that, and then showing what is relevant and important for you. right? So that's I think that's something that gets lost along the way and makes academia seem way more boring than it should be, because in fact it can be really exciting. I mean, the world of ideas can be really exciting, and there are new concepts coming out like intersectionality and so on that really shed a very different light on situations and can have a big impact on the world, right? Uh, so I want to talk about transdisciplinarity basically because we've been talking about thinking out of the box. That's one of the expressions people use about creativity, and one of the things that's happened to academia is, in the beginning, when you look at Greek philosophers or any philosophers or sages or wise people all over the world, they really dealt with everything, right? They could have dealt with health issues. They could have dealt with how people are feeling, things that we would now put in psychology, with what is important, with how do you deal with leaders. So that would come under, say, politics or something. But gradually, as more knowledge was accumulated, people became more and more specialized, right? I mean, in the West, if you look at if you look at Plato, 2,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years ago, um, Plato's Republic is considered one of the huge philosophical tomes about politics, but really it's based on an understanding of human psychology, right? And if you look today at histories of psychology and histories of politics, you'll see that at a certain point you start looking at exactly the same names because they were dealing with everything. And one of the interesting things that happened is that as these disciplines all were created and split off from mother philosophy, if you will, um, they lost contact with the other ones. So that, for instance, if you're looking at philosophy today, you will see that most at politics today or international relations or something related, right? You will see that there is really no understanding, no reflection on psychology, on human nature, and so on. And so they become very specialized, but also very disconnected from the rest of the discourse and looking at issues, the issues that are relevant to them from a very particular slant. When I was in graduate school and studying international relations, I was very interested in the cross-cultural dimensions of international relations, right? It's like, when the US and the Soviet Union were talking, it wasn't just about the number of nuclear missiles that they had, but there were also very important cultural aspects going on there. The US being a very individualistic country, Soviet Union being way more collectivistic, but also the U.S. never had, the U.S. wasn't invaded by Nazi Germany, The U.S. didn't lose 20 million people in the war against Germany, right? And this was something that was very alive for people in Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s still, right? I mean, my parents were alive at that time and, they'd been through World War II and my mother had to eat tulip bulbs the last year of the war because there was no food. And my grandparents' house in Italy was bombed and destroyed by the Allies while Naples while the Germans were in Naples. So that gives you a certain perspective on war. And American wars were always fought very far away, right? And so there were a lot of cultural and psychological issues that weren't being addressed. And, there was a tendency by some policymakers to just sort of ignore that and say, oh, well, that's just the soft stuff, right? Because counting missiles, that's what it's all about, right? Um, and when you look at the whole situation in Iraq, with Rumsfeld expecting joyous Iraqis to welcome us and say, "Hey, we're so glad you're here." Well, it didn't quite turn out that way, and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died, and lots of American men and women died uh, because there was no attention paid to this. And it's clear, everybody knows that Rumsfeld just completely dismissed anything like that. But then the question is, how do you educate people who make these kinds of decisions and in that world to incorporate all that sort of stuff in their decision making, right? I mean, if you look at, say, an MBA, or there are so many degrees now as environmental studies or an MBA that involve really drawing on multiple disciplines. If you look at your average MBA, you're taking stuff about the psychology of groups, you're taking leadership, you're taking finance, all a bunch of different disciplines, right? But nobody tells you, how do you put all that stuff together? Right. So that's what's happening. There's tons of fragmented knowledge out there. We have an enormous amount of knowledge, but it's all fragmented and people don't even know where to look for it. Right. And so one of the reasons why transdisciplinarity is important today is because we need more scholarship of integration. We need people who know that there's empirical research here about a certain situation and there, and they can bring it all together and weave it together creatively so that it gives you a different perspective on a certain issue. And that's only just now beginning. Journalists are doing it. Some people are doing it very skillfully and successfully, like Malcolm Gladwell. But Malcolm Gladwell has been criticized because, of course, he wants everything to look good. And if you start throwing too many caveats in there, too many, well, maybes, but in this situation, doesn't quite work, blink, right? His argument that first impressions can be very successful. Then it's not as fun for people to read because people they want a clear answer. But the truth is, the world is a lot messier than that. And transdisciplinarity, in a way, it's about relationality. It's about the relationship between the part and the whole, right? But it's also different from traditional approaches to inquiry in that uncertainty is a given. So it's not about how can we eliminate uncertainty so that we're certain about everything that we're doing and we can move ahead with certainty, because we ain't gonna be certain, right? I mean, that's just not how the world works these days, right? I mean, did anybody expect North Carolina, Asheville, to be flooding the way it's flooding now? I mean, there's so much, and in our daily lives, anything could happen. And so one of the things that transdisciplinarity focuses on is how do we deal with the world given the fact that you can't get rid of uncertainty, right? Which is also why improvisation becomes much more relevant, right? Anyway, before I go on to improvisation, any questions?
You were talking about the looking at the world through many different lenses. It reminds me of what we were just reading in the creative inquiry course in Riane Eisler and her description of the integrated systems theory that she identifies herself as being a part of. And I have never heard of those terms coming from a philosophy background. Nobody was ever talking in my halls of academia about systems theory and integrated systems theory. And I really appreciate her description and hearing you talk about it because it helps me make sense of my own curiosity and scholarship. How do I marry those? And my curiosity is all over the place. I'm interested in film. I'm interested in poetry. I'm interested in history. I'm interested in different cultures and indigeneity. I'm interested in certain histories of sexual violence and why is there genocide? There's so much that how do I make sense of it all? And being given language that says, Yes, invite all these different perspectives to help shed light on the subject of your inquiry. That's exciting to me, and I've never been invited to think that way until I got
Mm.
in this program. So this is all
Oh, good.
exciting sparks, synapses firing, part of the
Oh, that's
creative thing.
terrific.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for
Yes.
mentioning that. Yeah, I mean, I feel very connected to what you were saying because, I don't really identify with one particular discipline very much, although, I've spent a lot of time with psychology, but also a number of other disciplines. But part of the issue for me was that I've always been an outsider. I didn't really live in the country that issued my passport until I became a dual U.S. citizen in my 40s. So I was always a foreigner, and that has advantages and disadvantages. But one of the things that it does, it makes you look at whatever is around you in a way that's different from the people who live there and take everything for granted. And so I was interested sort of in looking at how we could look at things differently. And I have to say that I mean, obviously I'm still doing it and I'm trying to get other people on my side, but it's not always easy, and it's not always welcome, right? Because you're, in a way, you're telling people, the way that you're doing this is problematic, or you could be doing it differently, right? And you have to be very clear and articulate about what it is that you're proposing. And also, because other people take the way that they're doing something for granted, as like, well, this is just the way it is, and you come in from the outside, it can be like, what the hell are you talking about? It's just stupid, right? And so you have to really learn how to frame that. So if you're doing transdisciplinary work, that is also really an important issue. So if you're doing transdisciplinary work and if you're doing creative work, um, I spent many years doing consulting in Silicon Valley, and I like to work one-on-one with people. And I was working with this guy I did a 360. I mean, I interviewed a whole bunch of people that he worked with, and they all told me, oh, the most creative person I know. Like 12 people, all leaders in the organization. Oh, super creative. He was incredibly frustrated. He said, they just don't understand what I'm saying half the time, right? Because he looked at things from a different perspective. He was a super creative guy. Any situation, he would have a different view and look at it differently. And you know, it was tough. And I we talked at length about how to communicate and how to make sure that he wasn't people who are very creative tend to be more intuitive on the Myers-Briggs, so they don't present their ideas step by step by step, whereas most people tend to be sensation, which means that they like everything spelled out super clearly. Creative people have a tendency not to do that, so he sort of had to be trained into how to spell these ideas out very carefully. And in transdisciplinarity, it's the same kind of thing. You can, if you're coming at a topic from a multiplicity of perspectives that are not sort of indigenous to the main one that's being used, they'll have no idea what your terminology means, or they'll interpret it from within their perspective and just assume that you're wrong. Right. So you have to be really careful. So these are some of the things to keep in mind. But ultimately, I think there is increasing agreement that transdisciplinarity is needed to deal with complex issues. So, people talk about wicked problems, right? Wicked problems are all interconnected and they're all unstable and uncertain, but it's not just that. I think you can go back and look at issues like creativity or like race or like gender and look at what's been done and look at them from a transdisciplinary perspective and say, well, um, how would that change things if we looked at it differently? So creativity right now is viewed much more systemically from a systems perspective, And a systems perspective really is about viewing the world in, the ontology that we came here with was sort of Newtonian Cartesian, that the world was made of bits, of atoms, right? Of atoms that were not connected and that were stable, right? In response to that, and actually, we clearly got a lot done with that, right? I mean, the whole Industrial Revolution and what have you. So it's not like it was just a total disaster by any stretch of the imagination. But it's sort of reached its limit, and now people are talking about things like sustainability and looking at issues systemically, because in the effort to look at the world in terms of bits, people forgot the context, as I was saying, so that's why we have, environmental degradation and phenomena like that. But it also means, how do you look at the world in a way that's connected, not bound by individual disciplines? And through the connections, creativity happens, right? Because you're bringing together these phenomena that may have been disconnected previously because people weren't looking at them. Any questions?
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment that it kind of tickles me. I have a business background, and I would consider myself to be a practitioner scholar. And way back when, I wanted to go into HR, but HR didn't want me. And HR didn't want me because I didn't have an HR background, wasn't born here. And I had a very holistic background. I'd made it my mission in life to learn every function there was so I could figure out how to put things together to figure out how they fit. And it floored me that HR would not be interested in having me come into their department and work with them as an HR person, because I wasn't trained to be HR. And now if you look at the shift, everything is about strategic HR, where they're really trying to train HR people to look at things more holistically. So it's a little bit of a change, as you've been talking about, to see how things flip. But it just tickled me as I listened to you that I was able to frame it within my own experience.
Yeah, it's great that you can do that. That's a really important thing, because that's the other thing about transdisciplinarity. Like for me, if I'm teaching a course on transdisciplinarity, I can't use examples that are relevant to every single person, because our degrees being what they are, everybody's off doing different things. But one of the great skills that people need to develop is to be able to hear a story like you did and say, how would this apply to my world? And in the process, you're learning, and you're also exercising your brain in a good way, So kudos to you for doing that. And the whole issue of sort of territoriality was a big one in the rejection of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, every discipline has its territory that it's protecting because it's associated with funding. It's associated, how many faculty can we hire? How important are we in the university and things, all sorts of stuff like that, right? And so, there's a fantastic book by Bruce Wilshire, who wrote about sort of the purification of new faculty. New faculty would be hired and then purified of any allegiance to other disciplines, right? If you're a psychologist, you're only a psychologist. You can't be hanging out with sociologists or anthropologists, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi was a really well-known, established psychologist who started using a systems approach to creativity, and as a result looked not just as the individual, but also as what he called like the gatekeepers. So critics, or the kind of people who sort of establish whether your work is okay or not, and the whole larger domain. So the field that you're working in, but there'd be critics, reviewers, and then the field, and then the individual. So it was sort of a tripartite approach. And in saying that, in stepping outside of the frame that just focused on the individual, he said, well, I don't want this to be seen as a betrayal of creativity. I thought it was really interesting that he used that kind of language, because he was being very clear. Hey, I'm not betraying my people here, right? So there is all that. And at the same time, I think now there are definitely, as you pointed out, and there's an increased awareness of the importance of transdisciplinary approaches, and people can do some really interesting work that way that will make a considerable change, I think. Yeah. Any questions? We just have like 10 minutes left or something. A lot of changes in psychological theories have come from social justice movements. I'm not sure I said that, but it's an interesting thought. But definitely, so I mean, there have been when we're looking at things like intersectionality, for instance, it is with a view to being able to better assess what's going on, but also better assess how oppression shows up and where and for whom, how and for whom. Corey.
What's your advice on situating like our inquiry in a theory? How would you kind of like, yeah, just like what's your advice? How would you go about like finding a theory that, because I know it's supposed to align, like lead our inquiry forward. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is the first thing that you might want to do is find out what your perspective is. So you are willy-nilly a theorist already, right? So when you are approaching your topic, you come to it with certain assumptions about how you're going to frame it, right? Yeah, so what I would do is I would start with your getting a sense of what your perspective is. What are your assumptions about your topic, right? And one of the ways that you can figure out your own assumptions actually is by comparing it to what some of the other theories about your topic are, right? And also, what authors inspire you, right? So, Layla, you mentioned Rihanna Eisler, right? Right. I know. So if you're doing a certain kind of work, you could say your work draws on theoretical perspective created by Rihanna Eisler, right? So look for individuals and what perspectives they are using that you find interesting, relevant, and so on. And don't forget, if you're using integrative transdisciplinarity, you're already using a systems approach, right? Systems complexity approach, right? So you could just say you're doing that, and then you are also influenced by XYZ, right? Authors that are relevant to your particular topic. Because a systems approach is more of a foundational approach in the sense of how you think about a topic, you think of it in context, relationally, and so on. And then, of course, there are things that are relevant to the specific topic that you're studying. And you can refer to authors. The one thing I would say, do not use more than one method if you're doing qualitative research. Do not say you're draw on more than one theory, because people have a tendency to pile up. Like, I use the sub sandwich thing, and that's one of the things that shocked me when I first came to the US. All these thousands of flavorless cold cuts. Be like Edo sushi. Edo sushi is not the rolls with 500 different fish all twirled around, but it's the nigiri with like one beautiful slice of fish. And the reason why I say that is the more theories you use, the more methods you use, the more you have to explain the theory and you have to explain the method. And, why? Right? Layla.
I like Corey's question and your answer, and it makes me think of Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality.
Intersectionality, yes.
So if I'm inquiring about the intersection, then it can help sort of narrow, if I'm looking at the intersection of patriarchy and sexual violence and the consciousness that creates that, then I'm honing in on a few maybe people or theories or disciplines that can speak to that. I think the framework of interdisciplinarity helps invite people into my conversation and in my research. So
Yeah.
I think that's really,
Yeah.
I'm excited about connecting the creative inquiry with transdisciplinarity and intersectionality. I think
Great,
those three
great. Yeah, and one suggestion
pillars.
would be very often people will start by thinking, well, what disciplines will I draw on? And I would suggest do not start with disciplines, because that's still inquiry, that's still discipline driven rather than inquiry driven. Start with your inquiry and the questions that emerge from your inquiry. And then you go look for the answers wherever you can find them. And it'll be fairly obvious where you can look for some of them, certainly in the beginning. Because if you start with the disciplines and say, well, I'm going to draw on anthropology, philosophy, sociology, it's like, yikes, right? But start with the questions. That's much more doable. If you have an author that that has written one book or one article that you really like, find out everything that they've done, right? Doesn't mean that you will read everything that they've done, but typically most scholars that I know have immersed themselves in the work of at least a few people and taken a really deep dive. And, well, people who are well-known scholars all of a sudden will come up with a book about somebody that was a real influence on them. So sometimes I think there's a tendency to think that well, I can't get too involved with one author because I'm not going to be original anymore. But that's really not the case. And I don't know how many of you know Charlie Parker. Charlie Parker was one of the great innovators of jazz. Well, when he was coming up, he would learn the solos of Lester Young, who was an earlier player, off the records by heart. And he became, a hugely original player who really transformed jazz and created bebop and so on. So an immersion is a way sort of to really, in some ways by osmosis, pick up how the person thinks and how they feel and how they approach issues, and that's a good thing to do. And don't worry about I'm not going to be original, because your original ideas will always be there, and they'll always be there if and this is the identity thing, if you view yourself as a creative inquirer, if you view what you're doing, and if you view yourself as engaged in a creative activity, So that's why the creative frame is important, because it says, look, what I am doing here is being engaged in a creative process. And that sets the tone for your work, rather than, I just have to regurgitate what these other people are saying, right? Thank you very much. It was great to
Thank
see you
you.
all.